Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Tiago from NeuroNyumi, and if this is your first time here, I teach functional neurology and PDTR to manual therapists and rehab professionals who want more precise tools for complex cases. Today's session is about movement and strength, but from a slightly different angle than you might be used to. The title is How Nervous System Controls Movement and Where Therapists Go Wrong. In the next 50 to 60 minutes, we will cover three things. A simple input processing output model of motor control, three common clinical mistakes we make when we forget that movement and strength are neuro outputs, and a practical case example, a simple demo you can adapt in your own clinic. My promise is the same as in the last two webinars. You leave with a clearer way of thinking and at least 2 or 3 concrete tests or ideas you can try with your patients this week. Let me start with a very familiar story. You see a patient, maybe a runner, maybe someone with low back or knee pain, and your assessment shows a weak glute on one side. You prescribe glute work, you do some manual therapy, and strength improves in the session. And then, a week later, under loads, under fatigue, or under stress, the same pattern comes back. The same happens with tight hip flexors. You stretch, you mobilize, you work on the hip. It feels better on the table. Then, they go back to real life. And by the afternoon or after a run, same tightness, same movement strategy. If your mental model is this muscle is weak or this muscle is tight, these cases are genuinely frustrating. You keep thinking, did I pick the wrong exercise or they just need more load? Is the patient non-compliant? Today, I want you to look at it in a different way. Instead of thinking this muscle is lazy, you have to think movement and strength are outputs of the nervous system. They are decisions based on sensory inputs and context. Once you shift to that model, your mysterious weak glute starts to look like something else, a protective strategy built on the information the system is receiving. So let's build a simple model we can actually keep in our heads in clinic or gym. One of the major principles of the motor system is this. Motor control requires sensory input to accurately plan and execute movements. This applies at the spinal reflex level, all the way up to higher centers. So instead of thinking brain tells muscles what to do, think about this 3-step sequence. First, sensory input. Second, central processing. And third, motor output. In step 1, we have sensory input. The nervous system is constantly receiving information from proprioceptors in joints and muscles, tactile input from the skin, the vestibular system, and vision and other sensory channels. This information tells the system where the body is in space, where the segments are relative to each other, what the surface is like. Without good sensory input, movements become clumsy, poorly coordinated, and hard to control. In step 2, we have central processing. The brain and spinal cord integrate all the sensory input, compare it with internal models and previous experience, and then decides what motor commands make sense. You can think of this as identifying what is happening, selecting a response, programming the sequence of muscle activation required if the sensory information is noisy or incomplete, or if older protective patterns are still strongly wired. The system may choose strategies that look weird to us, but they are actually attempts to stay safe. In step 3, we have motor output. This is what you see and test. The movement pattern, the strength, the timing and endurance, the ability to stabilize a joint. Movement and strength are not just properties of muscles. They are the nervous system's best attempt to deal with the information it has. What goes wrong in real life when we forget this model? 3 common errors. You probably recognize some of them from your own practice. In error 1, only stretching what feels tight. The hip flexor feels tight, so we stretch that hip flexor. The hamstring feels tight, so we stretch the hamstring. Sometimes it helps, often doesn't last. Tightness is often a protective output, not purely a length problem. It can be the system saying, I don't trust this position, or I don't trust this loading pattern. If the underlying issue is a sensory mismatch, a stability issue somewhere else, or an old pattern, threat pattern, stretching the local tissue will not change that protective strategy. You might even get more guarding if the system feels more threatened. Takes us to error 2, chasing strength in protective patterns. We see a pattern we don't like, a knee that always dives in, a trunk that always shifts to one side, and we hammer it with strength work in exactly that compensation pattern. But some of those patterns are there to protect against perceived threat. A stiff ankle, a hip the system doesn't trust, pain-related nociceptive input inhibiting motor output. So instead of resolving the underlying issue, we are sometimes strengthening a protective strategy. That's why you can have patients who are objectively strong in the gym, but still move in a very guarded or inefficient way. The last one is error 3, testing muscles in isolation, out of context. We test the glute in prone, the quad in sitting, the shoulder in neutral, and everything looks amazing fine. But the real problems show up when the system has to integrate multiple inputs at once. Speed, load, rotation, visual and vestibular challenges, fatigue. So sensory motor control is context dependent. A patient can be strong in isolated table tests and fail the moment the movement becomes more complex or threatening. If we only test in easy, safe positions, we are not really testing the strategy the nervous system uses in real life. Let me give you a simple example of how changing sensory inputs can change motor output without any magic. You can do this at home or in your clinic. I'll describe one simple pattern. Step 1. Start with a simple functional test. A single leg stance with eyes open or an active hip abduction in standing. Notice what you see. Balance, control, range, any pain or stiffness. Step 2. Add a small sensory stimulus. Light skin stimulation around the hip, a gentle vibration near the ankle, or a brief tactile input over relevant area. Keep it simple. Step 3. Repeat the same movement immediately and see what changes. Sometimes control improves. Sometimes it gets worse. Sometimes nothing happens. That last one, nothing happening, is also useful information. The point is not to sell a magic trick. The point is to show that motor output is sensitive to sensory input and context. The system is always integrating information and updating its decision. In PDTR and in our courses, we make this more structured. We use manual reflex testing, perturbation or long leverage tests, and specific receptor challenges to systematically identify which inputs are distorting the output. But even with very simple tests, you can start to see that changing input can change movement right in front of your eyes. So you ask, where does PDTR fit into all this? PDTR is a functional neurology approach that focuses on proprioceptive and other sensory dysfunctions and their impact on motor control. It's based on neuroscience and neurophysiology, and it acts directly on the central nervous system to optimize motor control and responses. In practice, we use manual reflex testing plus specific sensory stimuli to identify which receptors and pathways are giving faulty information. Then we apply corrective inputs to normalize those signals and immediately retest the movement. So instead of just saying your glute is weak, we ask, in which context is weak? Which sensory inputs makes it better or worse? What happens if we change those inputs? You don't stop doing your manual therapy or your rehab work. You add a layer on top that tells you where and when to apply those tools to get more reliable changes. This is why many clinicians who integrate PDTR end up being the people in their city who can deal with complex movement problems. The runner who kept breaking down, the shoulders with perfect strength tests but terrible control, and the patients who failed standard rehab. Clinically, this way of thinking changes a lot. You stop blaming the patient's weak muscles or your choice of exercise, and you start asking better questions about input, context, and strategy. You become more precise about what you test, what you change, and what you expect to see. For your career, it also changes how people see you. When you can explain movement as a neuro output, when you can demonstrate changes by working with the nervous system as well as tissues, you are no longer offering the same as every standard manual therapy or rehab clinic around you. You become the person colleagues send their more complex cases to. If this way of thinking resonates, and you want a step-by-step assessment and treatment system instead of just collecting more and more techniques, that's exactly what we work on in the PDTR Foundation courses around Europe. We have foundations running in Portugal, Spain, Serbia, Germany, and Cyprus in 2027. Full 3-module trainings from basic sensory and motor physiology to complex case applications. You will find all the details and dates through NeuroNewMe's website and our social media links. Movement and strength are not just about muscles. They are outputs of the nervous system. The quality of the output depends on the quality and organization of the input and processing. When we ignore that, we end up stretching what feels tight, strengthening compensations, and testing muscles in isolation. And we wonder why things keep coming back. Change the input and you change the output. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions about today's content or about the courses, send us a message on Instagram or via the website contact form. I'm happy to help. See you in the next webinar.